Good morning, congregation, and welcome again to this Sunday service. It's good to be with you. I don't know how your working week has gone, but I hope it's not been too stressful. That's why we need the Lord's Day or Christian Sabbath to rest from our labours and to recuperate our energies for the forthcoming week. Even God himself, on the first week of creation, rested upon the seventh day. Well, we don't rest on the seventh day, we rest on the first day of the week, the Sunday, because Christ rose from the dead upon that day. I hope you've had a good week. I hope you will enjoy the service this morning. I do hope that you will get a lot of benefit from it, and I do hope that you will write in your response to the sermon that we're going to shortly have on the Celtic Church. Christianity, Sermon 5, the Celtic Church. But before we come to that sermon, let us come to God, our Heavenly Father, in prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we praise Thee for this day that Thou hast given. This is the Lord's Day, and You have made it, and we shall rejoice in it. But we also thank You, O Lord, our Heavenly Father, in the name of Thy Son, for the week that has just passed, and for the week that is to come, that You have given us work. But on Thy day, the day when Thy Son rose from the dead, Thou hast given us rest from our labours. We ask, O Lord, that as we consider this sermon on British Christianity, as we did on English Christianity the weeks before, we pray for a blessing, so that we might appreciate our historic and Christian heritage in these days of great darkness and evil. For we ask these things in the name of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, who with Thee and the Holy Ghost ever reign, one God. Amen. Christianity, Sermon 5, the Celtic Churches. In the last two sermons we looked at the migration of the Anglo-Saxons to Britain and at their soon conversion to Christianity, together with the tremendous impact that their conversion had on their politics, their laws, their culture, and their society. By the 8th century, the English as a nation in several kingdoms had already begun to evangelize or gospel their brethren in Frisia and in Germany beyond the Rhine. By the 10th century, there was one English kingdom and a well-endowed English church. The English had absorbed much that was worthy in the Christian traditions of both the continent and of the Celtic fringe. That must now bring us to another story. Christianity had come to Britain before the coming of the English. The English or Anglo-Saxon migration had begun in earnest about the mid-5th century AD, whilst the Roman imperial power still held sway over much of Western Europe, though it was soon to evaporate. But Christianity had come to the Britons, that is, to the Celtic or British-speaking dwellers south of the Forth and Clyde, almost as soon as the Roman legions came here to conquer and to stay, during the reign of one Claudius, who, as first citizen of Rome, the Princeps, had authorized the conquest of the Britons, in part to bolster his imperial claims, which were not particularly good, to the throne of Rome. This invasion by so great an imperial power, one of the world's empires, was not long after the crucifixion and the rising again from the dead of Christ. It is beyond question that some of the Roman legionaries would have been Christian, or would have at least heard of the cult of Christ. The Roman Empire was one empire, well connected by roads, and news travelled quickly. It is to this story of British Christianity that we must now turn, for it was the Britons, the ancient Britons, who were the first Christians in what was then, once, their country. It is not altogether a straightforward story, however, and ultimately it is not confined to the Britons either. They were, in the closing stages of the Roman world, to pass their Christianity on to others. whilst they were losing their own country, and they were to pass it on to their Celtic neighbours to the west and then to the north, as well as to the Anglo-Saxons. The Celtic Church is a story in its own right, and an important part of the modern British heritage and identity. Christianity rapidly spread within the Roman Empire. On the first day of the New Testament Church, as related in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, the first Jews who believed on Christ, beyond the original 120 disciples who met in the upper room, included Jews from almost every nation under heaven of the known world at that time. They included Jews from as far west as Rome, from as far north as Pontus, from as far to the east as Persia, and from as far south as Arabia. The God of all history had prepared this for the spread of the word of his well-beloved Son, who he bruised for our transgressions and whom he raised from the dead. When the mission of Barnabas and Paul began from Syrian Antioch in about 43 AD, precisely when the Romans invaded Britain, the church was already well established in Palestine and thereabouts, such as in northern Syria, where Antioch was. And the church was about to spread rapidly and deeply over the whole of the eastern and middle provinces of the empire. There was a well-established church in Rome by the time of Paul's visit there, and the writings from its presiding overseer, Clement of Rome, survive down for us today, and are dated variously as either the mid-1st century or the latter part of the 1st century. The church at Rome was at that time a largely Greek-speaking church, and abode so for 3 centuries. Rome was inundated with Greek speakers, and it was a church so well established that its elders or bishops were able to admonish other churches, such as the one at Corinth, with brotherly advice and admonition. Both Corinth and Rome were, in their churches, Greek-speaking, and were well connected to one another by sea, by culture, and by trade. But the empire throughout was well connected by roads. This was part of Roman military strategy and political policy, to keep the empire one and well defended. It was through such well-connectedness that, amongst other things, the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ spread to all the nations or ethnic groups within the empire. Soon the gods and goddesses, the demons and idols of heathendom were falling before the Maker of heaven and earth, who, in the person of his well-beloved Son, had died for the sins of the whole world. Not only was redemption for the chosen of the Jews, but for the chosen or elect of all nations under heaven, whereunto it had now come. We must call to mind that God's calling of the Jews through Abraham was precisely to bring a blessing to all nations. Genesis 12 and verse 3. The fullness of time had now come, when God should send forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, as Paul says in Galatians 4 and verse 4, and the coming of Christ was a fulfillment of that long ago behest of Genesis 12 and verse 3, and it was a bringing in of that blessing long ago forspoken. The Britons of the Roman province of Britain were soon responsive to the glad tidings of Christ. How do we know? Well, in 200 AD, the African church father Tertullian, Africa being the Roman province in North Africa, roughly equivalent to modern Asia, Tertullian refers to the establishment of churches, that is, of congregations of Christians in Britain. 40 years later, in 240 AD, Origen of Alexandria adverts to the fact that the new faith was a unifying element amongst the Romano-Britons. From about this time, plate Metal plate of a Christian provenance or origin has been found recently, in 1975 to be precise, in excavations of the Nene Valley in what is now eastern England. This plate was clearly from a settled, not a travelling church. In the late 3rd century, the British Christian Alban was martyred at Verulamium, now St. Albans. Earlier, one Julius and Aaron had been martyred between 249 and 251 AD. In 314 AD, 3 British bishops attended the church council of Arles in Gaul. British bishops also attended the council of Rimini in Italy in 359 AD. Despite the distances involved, Brythonic Christians and their church were involved in and represented among the Catholic or Orthodox churches of the ancient world. That is a tremendous achievement for a people on the far rim of the empire. It was important to have been noticed by the bigger churches elsewhere. Some historians have doubted whether the church was strongly established in Roman Britain in the 2nd century, and well organised by the 3rd century, in the light of the fact that there is not much archaeological evidence for it. What are we to make of this? Well, it ignores the fact that the church is not a building but a congregation, that the church was often a community of faith rapidly expanding amongst the poor and dispossessed, as the New Testament bears witness, that the churches often met in private houses, and that it was only much later that they could take public buildings to themselves. Archaeological evidence would not be able to distinguish a private dwelling being used as a meeting house for a church from any other kind of private dwelling. So that puts play to that bit of scepticism from someone, I suspect, with an anti-Christian agenda. Certainly, it is admitted that the Christian church in Britain became strong, even dominant, with the conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century. However, the fate of this strong British church was sealed with the fate of the British themselves, as the invading hordes of Angles and Saxons came across the waters and up the long, slow, winding estuaries of eastern Britain to make their settlements over what once had been Celtic lands. But to the west, and as the English march continued, British Christianity survived. Britain now entered a dark tunnel where, at the start of it in about 459 AD, with the coming of the first main wave of invaders, we have a Celtic Britain, and at the end of it, at about 597 AD, with the coming of Augustine of Rome, we have a clearly demarcated Anglo-Saxon England. The period in between has not left many written historical sources. All we have is the accounts in Germany of the leaving of great numbers of Saxons and many Angles for Britain, and in Britain we have the record of Bede as to the coming of the English, and from the Celtic sources, Welsh and Breton, we hear of the woes of the Britons. But we are interested in Christianity in this period, and it is clear that it was suffering along with the woes of the Britons. The Anglo-Saxon reintroduced heathen worship and cremated burial sites, which demark their progress, as covering much of England up until the late 7th century, when they began to be converted to Christianity. Roughly, this covers a line from just north of the Humber across southern Britain to just east of Devon. The Anglo-Saxon advance had not yet included all of the West Midlands or much of the North-West, nor had it yet pushed into Borders and Lothian from their beachhead in Northumberland. Their advance did represent, however, a massive loss to the Christian churches which had grown up amongst the Britons. But Christ said that he would build his church, and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, whilst lands were being lost in the east of the country. Providence would have it that out of evil would come good, just as Samson had proven that out of strength would come forth sweetness. The woes of the Britons, as well as including the coming of the Saxons, also included the raids of the Scots, the Gaels, from Ireland, and of the Picts from north of the Wold, what is now largely Scotland. One Briton, Patrick, who lived from 389 to 461 AD, born and dwelling in what is now England, was captured and carried off to the Emerald Island by a raiding band of Gaels. As Christianity retreated in the east, it would now spread to lands in the west which had never been subjected to the Roman imperial standard. Patrick was mightily used by God for the conversion of the Emerald Isle to the religion of Christ, and this while Britain was itself beginning to fall to the Saxons and Angles. God moves in mysterious ways his wonders to perform. Patrick was doubtless a British patriot, and would have done all he could to save his own homeland from invasion, if the situation he found himself in would have allowed it. But in his case it did not. We must do what we can in the situation that God has placed us. If we can influence the historical situation, then we must try to do so. But it is not always the case that we can. Patrick could not. Rather than become an Arthur to fight the Anglo-Saxons, he became an apostle to convert the O'Briens. And that was a mighty conversion. Patrick could not save the Britons, but he could and did convert the Gaels. Thus, as much of Britain fell to the Anglo-Saxons, Celtic Christianity was given a new refuge and home among the Irish. And it was from Ireland that it would spread to the north of modern Britain, what we now call Scotland. The conversion of Caledonia, to give the land of the Picts its Roman name, was due to the mission of Columba, who lived from 521 to 615 AD. He left Hibernia, Ireland, in 563, and established on Iona in what is now Scotland a mission base. This was situated to facilitate missionary work amongst the incoming Scots, and to reach and evangelize the incoming Angles of Northumbria. The Celtic Church, in its Irish form, was thus the first church to make large inroads amongst the Anglo-Saxons. It was maybe too much to expect the Britons to gospel their displacers, although some did, such as Owain of Ely. But the Gaelic Christians who did gospel them had themselves been evangelized by, amongst others, the British Christian Patrick. The Celtic Church thus survived. It was as original as the Roman, the Gallic, and the Iberian churches to the south of what is now, or what was now, the English Channel. Its own local brand of ritual and ceremonial was practised in the north and west of the British Isles and amongst the northern English. But it differed from the more standardized forms of continental Christianity, which had become so through the focus on unity given by early ecumenical councils to the Patriarch of the West, that is, to the Bishop of Rome, somebody that we would call the Pope later on. Ultimately, it would be that standardized form of ritual that would prevail amongst both the English and the Celts. At the Synod of Straonshull, later Whitby, in 664 AD, the English king of Northumbria, Oswiu, chose the more standardized practices of the continent over the local variation of rituals as practised by the Celts, for the fixing of the date of Easter and for certain forms of wear. This brought the whole of the Christianity of the British Isles, both Anglo-Saxon and Celtic, more in line with the rest of Christianity in the West, the East remaining just as original, even more so in many respects, but also more fragmented. And thus we have the story, the great story of the Celtic Church. It is a great story of great progress, in troubled and discouraging times. But to it we owe the first conversions of the Anglo-Saxons, and then the tremendous part that they played under the influence of Celtic enthusiasm and ardour in the conversion of the continental Germans. God is the God of all history, and he brings good out of evil. But that is not to say that we should allow evil to triumph, or to have its sway. No, we must oppose it wherever we find it. But if we cannot be an Arthur fighting the invaders, then we can at least be a Patrick or a Columba converting them. May God bless us all. And now may the grace of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost rest with us and abide upon us, now and evermore.